Section 5. The universe is multidimensional. The word dimension is crucially important to understanding the many worlds that lie beyond this one, and you may be wondering what I mean by it. My definition is similar to common usage, but it's also a bit different. In the context of this book, dimensions are ways of describing the characteristics of a specific world and its inhabitants according to how many traits they possess. For instance, the first dimension is a world made up of straight lines, which themselves are points strung together. If the first dimension had inhabitants, their length would be the only way to distinguish one from another. If two inhabitants were exactly the same length, no one would be able to tell them apart. The second dimension is a world of length and width, which introduces the existence of a plane. If the second dimension had inhabitants, they would look like paper cutouts. If two people were exactly the same shape and size, they would be indistinguishable. Then what about the third dimension, the world we inhabit now? This world is composed of three elements that define physical shape and form as we know it: length, width, and height. In the third dimension, two people could be exactly identical if they shared exactly the same proportions of these three elements. This provides a more sophisticated way of distinguishing one person from another. In the fourth dimension, the element of time is added to length, width, and height. In our world, things that exist in the same general space will also exist in the same time. But this is not the case in the fourth dimension. When you meet someone here on Earth and shake hands, both of you shared the same moment on the same day, of the same week, in the same year. It is different in the fourth dimension, where two people shaking hands could be living in completely different periods in history. For example, if two Americans were meeting and shaking hands at a specific location, it would be possible for one of them to be from the colonial period and the other to have lived during the Great Depression. This would never happen in the third dimension, but it happens all the time in the fourth. In the fourth dimension, it is difficult to tell if the building in front of you exists now or if it stood there centuries ago, because even if it were an image from the past, you would still be able to touch it and feel it as if it were real. In the world of the fourth dimension, everybody's watch shows a different time. You could meet a beautiful woman in her early 20s who lived on Earth in Japan's Heian period, 794 through 1195. The same principle applies to future events. Inhabitants of the fourth dimension can predict something that will occur in the third dimension's future, because for them it would seem as if it were occurring right now. The fifth dimension introduces the element of spiritual virtue. Its inhabitants are distinct from one another, not only in shape and the time period to which they belong, but also in the level of their spiritual awareness. Having spiritual awareness, knowing that we are fundamentally spiritual beings, is a requirement for becoming an inhabitant of this world. This element of spirituality is principally measured by goodness. Therefore, the fifth dimension is a world filled with virtuous people. Knowledge of the truths is the additional element found in the sixth dimension, which means that the inhabitants of this world are different in all the ways of the fifth dimension, as well as in their knowledge of the truths. The qualifications of living in the sixth dimension are virtue and having learned Buddha's teachings. Of course, the degree of learning varies from person to person. Differences in the level of study determine the finer distinctions that exist within the sixth dimension. But every inhabitant of this dimension believes and trusts in the truths.